He whispered, "Forgive me," before the gunfight. But not to the men lining the street with pistols drawn. He said it to the woman standing in the shadow of the church door. Only she heard him. Only she understood why he had chosen to stay. The town of Red Willow sat quiet under a bruised evening sky, holding the kind of silence that comes right before blood is spilled. Dust hung in the air like a held breath. The saloon doors across the street creaked once, then settled. Horses stamped nervously, sensing what men tried to deny. Ethan Cole stood in the center of the road, boots planted, shoulders squared. Was worn thin, his hat pulled low. To the town, he looked like any other gunman who'd drifted in and stayed too long. To Clara Hayes, he was the man who had saved her life and ruined his own. Clara clutched the shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had buried her husband 2 winters ago. Buried him with her own shaking hands when the fever took him, leaving her alone with a small ranch and a heart too tired to hope. She had learned how quickly a woman could disappear in the West, how loneliness could be as deadly as a bullet. Ethan had come to her ranch one stormy night, half dead in the snow. A stranger with a gunshot wound and eyes full of regret. She should have turned him away. Instead, she lit a candle, boiled water, and stitched his flesh while he drifted between fever and confession. He never told her his full story, only fragments. A wrong decision, a brother buried, a life he couldn't outrun. But Clara saw the man beneath the sins. She saw how he fixed her fence without being asked, how he spoke softly to her horse, how he stared at the horizon like someone waiting for judgment. She watched him chop wood, not with brute force, but with a steady rhythmic peace, as if each swing of the axe was a penance. He'd taught her how to sight a rifle, his hands gentle as they guided hers, his voice low and patient. In his quiet presence, the heavy silence of her ranch had transformed into a comfortable quiet. Hope, a feeling she thought long buried, began to stir. Red Willow noticed him too. They saw it in the small things. They noticed when he refused to drink at the saloon, when he paid fairly for his supplies, when trouble seemed to quiet down whenever he entered a room. The children, who once ran from strangers, started to watch him with curiosity, not fear. He was an enigma, a man wrapped in violence, who sought only peace. And then, Sheriff Markland arrived 3 weeks later, riding in on a tired gray horse, holding a folded paper and a cold expression. He'd unrolled it in the general store, his voice flat as he read the words aloud. "A man named Ethan Cole," the sheriff had said, his eyes scanning the faces of the townsfolk. "Wanted for a killing in Wyoming. Reward says, dead or alive." The town turned its eyes to Clara's ranch. Suddenly, the quiet man who fixed fences was a killer. The whispers started immediately, spreading like wildfire. Fear, greed, and judgment poisoned the air. Men who had nodded to Ethan in the street now looked at him with hard eyes, weighing the silver against a man's life. Ethan could have run. He knew the trails better than anyone. He knew the dark places where a man could disappear. Clara begged him to go, her voice breaking as she stood in the very doorway where she had once saved his life. The wind whipped her hair across her face, mirroring the storm inside her heart. "Go, Ethan, please," she pleaded, her hands gripping his arm. "They'll kill you." "I won't," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking with desperation and confusion. "Why stay when it'll cost you everything?" He looked at her then, and for a moment, he wasn't a fugitive, not a gunman, but simply a man who had finally found something worth losing. "Because running," he said, his gaze unwavering, is what made me this way in the first place. Now, the moment had come. Across from Ethan stood 3 bounty hunters, lured by the promise of coin. They were hard-faced men with steady hands and empty eyes. Behind them, Sheriff Markland watched, a man torn between the letter of the law and the doubt in his own heart. He'd seen the change in Red Willow since Ethan's arrival, a subtle shift towards something better. Clara couldn't stay in the shadows. She stepped forward, an involuntary movement, a desperate plea. "Ethan," she whispered, the name catching in her throat. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see her. The setting sun dipped low, setting his face in fire and shadow, making him look like a figure from a legend. "I stayed," he said softly, his voice carrying across the silent street. "Meant only for her, because someone finally saw me as more than my worst day." His hand hovered near his holster, a silent promise of what was to come. The entire town held its breath. Clara's eyes filled with tears, blurring the terrible scene before her. She remembered the night he sat by her fire, staring into the flames, the light dancing in his haunted eyes. "If I die," he'd said then, his voice barely a whisper, "I want it to mean something. I want my end to be better than my beginning." Now, with guns raised and fate closing in, Ethan leaned his head just enough for her to hear. "Forgive me," he whispered into the wind. She shook her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, hot against her cold skin. "For what?" "For staying long enough to make you care." A gun cocked. The sharp, metallic sound cut through the silence. The wind kicked up a cloud of dust, a temporary shroud between the living and the dead. Hot against her cold skin. For what? For staying long enough to make you care. A gun cocked. The sharp, metallic sound cut through the silence. The wind kicked up a cloud of dust, a temporary shroud between the living and the dead. And in that single eternal heartbeat, before the first shot rang out, Clara realized the truth he had never spoken aloud. And whatever happened next, whatever choice was made in that cloud of dust and fear, would change Red Willow forever. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales from. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. We'll see you in the next one. She didn't remember crossing the street, didn't feel the grit of the road under her feet. Her world narrowed to one single point, dropping to her knees beside Ethan, pressing her hands desperately against the wound. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, his lips pale. He opened his eyes and found her face hovering above him, blurred by her tears. She didn't remember crossing the street, didn't feel the grit of the road under her feet. Her world narrowed to one single point, dropping to her knees beside Ethan, pressing her hands desperately against the wound. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, his lips pale. He opened his eyes and found her face hovering above him, blurred by her tears. She didn't remember crossing the street, didn't feel the grit of the road under her feet. Her world narrowed to one single point, dropping to her knees beside Ethan, pressing her hands desperately against the wound. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, his lips pale. He opened his eyes and found her face hovering above him, blurred by her tears. He managed a faint smile, a ghost of his usual self. "I already did," he whispered. "For years." One of the bounty men, a tall man with a cruel face, stepped forward, his eyes glinting with greed. "Sheriff," he said, his voice grating, "that reward's still." Sheriff Markland lifted a hand, cutting him off. "Enough. You should have run," she sobbed, her voice breaking. He managed a faint smile, a ghost of his usual self. "I already did," he whispered. "For years." One of the bounty men, a tall man with a cruel face, stepped forward, his eyes glinting with greed. "Sheriff," he said, his voice grating, "that reward's still." "You should have run," she sobbed, her voice breaking. He managed a faint smile, a ghost of his usual self. "I already did," he whispered. "For years." One of the bounty men, a tall man with a cruel face, stepped forward, his eyes glinting with greed. "Sheriff," he said, his voice grating, "that reward's still." Sheriff Markland lifted a hand, cutting him off. "Enough. You should have run," she sobbed, her voice breaking. He managed a faint smile, a ghost of his usual self. "I already did," he whispered. "For years." One of the bounty men, a tall man with a cruel face, stepped forward, his eyes glinting with greed. "Sheriff," he said, his voice grating, "that reward's still." Sheriff Markland lifted a hand, cutting him off. "Enough." Clara could only shake her head. Her vision completely blurred by tears. Ethan exhaled slowly. His name was Thomas Cole. His voice barely a whisper. Yet carried across the silent street. He was my brother. He was my brother. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the story they had heard. He was drunk. Ethan continued. He was drunk. His voice strained but steady. Clara could only shake her head, her vision completely blurred by tears. Ethan exhaled slowly, a pained breath. His name was Thomas Cole, he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried across the silent street. He was my brother. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the story they had heard. He was drunk, Ethan continued, his voice strained but steady. Clara held Ethan tighter, her tears falling onto his blood-stained coat. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice thick with a mix of awe and heartbreak. "Even knowing this could happen." Ethan nodded weakly, his eyes fixed on hers. "Because if I kept running," he said, "I'd never become the man you believed I was." Her tears falling onto his blood-stained coat. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice thick with a mix of awe and heartbreak. "Even knowing this could happen." Ethan nodded weakly, his eyes fixed on hers. "Because if I kept running," he said, "I'd never become the man you believed I was." The bounty men shifted their weight, impatient. One of them spat into the dirt. "Sheriff, the law's the law." Markland stood slowly, turning to face them, his shadow long in the failing light. "The law also says a man's entitled to the truth." He looked back down at Ethan, his decision made. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice firm, alive. Relief and fear collided in Clara's chest like a physical blow. They carried Ethan to the jailhouse, the crowd of townspeople partying like a tide to let them through. Clara followed, her hand never leaving Ethan's, until they had to gently pry her fingers away at the cell door. That night, "I already did," she whispered back, her fingers lacing with his. "But don't ask me to forget." Just then, a shadow moved at the window. The unmistakable, metallic click of a rifle hammer being pulled back cut through the silence. Clara turned, her heart leaping into her throat, just as the window glass shattered inward. I already did, she whispered back, her fingers lacing with his. But don't ask me to forget. Just then, a shadow moved at the window. The unmistakable, metallic click of a rifle hammer being pulled back cut through the silence. Clara turned, her heart leaping into her throat, just as the window glass had decided not to wait for the law. And this time, Ethan couldn't stand to face them. Thanks for watching. If this story hooked you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another chapter. In our Tales from the West, see you next time. Thanks for watching. If this story hooked you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another chapter. In our Tales from the West, see you next time. A rifle shot shattered the jailhouse window, sending glass raining across the floor. Clara screamed as Sheriff Markland spun, drawing his revolver. The lantern toppled, throwing wild shadows against the walls. Outside, boots pounded the dirt men, moving fast, careless now, driven by greed instead of law. Ethan pushed himself upright despite the pain, gripping the bars. Blood soaked through his bandage, but his eyes were clear. They won't stop, he said hoarsely. Not until it's finished. Markland cursed under his breath and fired through the broken window, forcing the men back for a moment. Stay down, he ordered Clara. But she didn't move. She stood there, shaking, realizing something terrible and undeniable. Red Willow was about to become a place stained forever, unless someone chose mercy over violence. Another shot struck the door. Wood splintered. They'll kill you, Clara whispered to Ethan. Even if you survive tonight. Ethan met her gaze, steady and calm, the way he had looked the first night she stitched his wound by candlelight. I know. Markland turned toward the cell, jaw tight. Cole, he said, lowering his gun. I can get you out the back. The horses are ready. Ethan shook his head slowly. No more running. The door cracked under another blow. Ethan stepped closer to the bars. Sheriff, if you let me out, I'll end this without more blood. Markland hesitated. Law battled conscience in his eyes. Clara reached for the keys at the sheriff's belt before she could stop herself. Her hands trembled as she held them out. I believe him, she said. I always have. Markland searched her face, then Ethan's. Finally, he nodded. The cell door opened with a heavy groan. Ethan stepped out, unsteady but determined. He took Markland's spare revolver, then paused. He removed his own gun belt and handed it to Clara. This one stays clean, he said softly. She realized then what he meant. The front door burst open. 3 bounty men flooded in, guns raised, then froze when they saw Ethan standing in the open, weapon lowered. It's over, Ethan said. No reward is worth this. One man laughed nervously. You think we came all this way to walk out empty? Ethan met his eyes. I killed my brother to stop him from killing again. If you pull that trigger, you'll become the very thing you claim to hunt. The men faltered. Markland stepped forward. You fire, you answer to me. And every witness in this town. Silence stretched. Then one bounty man lowered his rifle. Another followed. The third hesitated, rage twisting his face, then dropped his gun into the dirt. They turned and left without another word. Red Willow exhaled. Ethan's knees buckled. Clara caught him as he fell, holding him like she was afraid he might fade into the floorboards. Markland called for help, and townsfolk rushed in not with fear this time, but with resolve. Ethan survived the night. Days passed. The wound healed slowly, and so did the town. Sheriff Markland sent a full report east, including the truth left out years before. Weeks later, a letter arrived, stamped and official. Charges dismissed. Act of justified defense. Clara read it aloud on her porch, as Ethan sat beside her, thinner now, quieter but alive. "I guess I'm finally free," he said. She smiled sadly. "Freedom's not the same as peace." He looked out at the ranch, at the fence he'd repaired, the land he'd chosen. "Then maybe I'll earn that next." Seasons turned. Snow came, then melted. Red Willow changed in small ways, gentler ways. People remembered the night a man chose to stay and face his past instead of fleeing it. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the plains, Ethan stood outside Clara's cabin. He removed his hat, hands trembling not from fear this time, but hope. "I once asked you to forgive me," he said. "I won't ask again." She stepped closer. "Good, because forgiveness isn't what kept you here." He met her eyes. "What did?" She took his hand and placed it over her heart. "This." Ethan exhaled, a sound halfway between laughter and a prayer. "Then, let me stay," he said. "Not as a man running, not as a man hiding, but as one who's finally learned what his life is for." Clara leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. The wind moved softly through the grass, carrying away the ghosts that once followed his name. Years later, people would still tell the story. Not about the gunfight, not about the blood, but about the man who whispered "forgive me" before the guns were drawn and stayed long enough to become worthy of it. And in Red Willow, forgiveness didn't come from words. It came from choosing love when leaving would have been easier. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe for more. We'll see you next time.